So one of the main problems I think concerning approaches to the Syrian revolution is generalizations. I think that academics, journalists, and analysts attempt to simplify things so that people who maybe aren't too familiar with a country with complicated dynamics like Syria can understand. But I think that this process of simplification is harmful in the end because too many things are lost along the way to call it beneficial. So what I want to do for my myth-busting session is deconstruct some of those simplifications of who composes the different parties within the Syrian conflict. Basically, I want to deconstruct the notion that the regime is an Alawi regime and the opposition is a Sunni opposition or a jihadist opposition. So I want to start with the claim that the regime is an Alawi regime. I think that this in itself is a very harmful classification in the first place because it sets the ground for the Alawi versus Sunni sectarian framing of the Syrian revolution. So while it is true that the upper echelon of the regime is Bashar al-Assad and his close advisors, who are mostly Alawites and who are also mostly close family members, part of the regime's social base has been for a while the mostly Sunni bourgeoisie of Damascus and to a lesser extent Aleppo. These are the people who have stood by the regime for a long time, ever since the economic liberalization policies of Hafiz al-Assad that started in the late 1970s. These old bourgeoisie sectors were very hostile to the political elites of the Ba'athist Party from 1960 to 1970. This was the Ba'athist socialist period, when the Ba'ath Party was more defined by its ideological fervor. When Hafiz al-Assad came into power in 1970, he was seen as a pragmatist, someone who wasn't very socialist. The New York Times headline of that internal coup in 1970 was actually "Coup against the Marxist wing of the Ba'ath Party." So he slowly started opening up to the business community. And we started seeing the shift in the Ba'ath social base from, whereas before it was mostly allied with labor and farmers and minorities, you see the shift towards the business classes, most of whom, but certainly not all, but most of whom were Sunnis living in the urban areas. The real apex of this shift came in 1982 when the regime killed up to 40,000 people in the Hama massacre. The Sunni business classes of Damascus and other cities as well famously did not stand with their Sunni brethren in Hama. In fact, they were either silent or openly stood with the regime. In fact, top members of the business community appeared on television with Hafiz al-Assad shortly after in a very symbolic act to show that we aren't going to stand against the regime, we're going to stand with it, even though it's just killed 40,000 people in Hama. So on the one hand, there are Sunnis within the base of the regime, but on the other hand, there's this notion that all Alawis have become wealthy or have greatly benefited from the regime, and that isn't true either. In fact, a lot has stayed the same. Many Alawites feel like the only way to achieve upward mobility today is to join the ranks of the army, which is exactly what they've been encouraged to do since French colonialism. Many still live in the rural Alawite heartlands in villages around Latakia and Tartus, but many more have engaged in migration to the cities, such as Damascus and Homs. Now, this migration of Alawites from those places to the more urban areas has itself caused a lot of tension in Syria. Let me be clear, like these rural urban migrants are not wealthy by any means. But in relative terms, for example, to many of the Sunnis in Homs, they were accorded just a few more privileges than everyone else. And those few privileges led to vast resentment amongst the other people in Homs, because basically it's a classic tactic of the ruling class to accord some privileges to a certain community in an attempt to divide people. So what happens then is they exercise those privileges over the people who are lower than themselves on the ladder, and they defend those privileges till the death. This tension existed before the revolution. So many people try to paint this picture of Syria as before 2011 as this utopia of sectarian coexistence, but it simply was not true. There was a lot of sectarian tension brewing under the surface. So even if we didn't see it if you didn't see it in the everyday lives of, when you were as an outside observer, it certainly did exist, especially amongst the working and farmer classes as different sects were pit against each other by the regime and economic elites through patronage. So that concludes the regime is Alawi myth busting. Now I want to move to the opposition as Sunni or the opposition as jihadists. So recently, I think most of the Syria conversation has been focused on the fact that, oh, the opposition is dominated by Al-Qaeda factions, or who are the rebels really? You know, are they heart eaters? Are they freedom fighters? So what I want to claim, I want to make two claims about the jihadists in particular. So many people say that the jihadists have begun to say that the jihadists are Assad agents. Now, while I don't want to, while I think that claim is a bit exaggerated, I want to claim that there is credence to the idea that Assad helped bring the dominance of the jihadis about. And second, and although I'm definitely not the first to claim this, I just want to reiterate that these jihadist groups are not the revolutionary forces, they are the counter-revolutionaries within the Syrian uprising. Now, when I say the jihadis were brought about by Assad, it doesn't necessarily mean that Assad supported them or organized them directly. What I mean is that he paved the way for them to emerge. Many would challenge this claim by asking why Assad would seem to prefer the emergence of what are today his biggest enemies. The answer is that despite that, Assad knows that he can deal, or at least live longer, dealing with a jihadist insurgency. And he has made similar calculations in the past. For example, when protests first broke out in March 2011 in Daraa, the policy of the regime was violent repression. Now, violent repression of mass protest movements only have two outcomes. Either you silence the protest movement, or the protest movement becomes an armed struggle, okay? And outcome number two wasn't exactly what Assad was hoping for, but it was a risk he was willing to take. He would rather have Syrians resort to armed struggle than see the continuation of mass politics and mass protest. So in any case, I bring that up because with the jihadists, I believe Assad made a similar calculation. He figured that if he could portray the opposition movement as composed of mostly dangerous fundamentalists, the West and other powers would be less likely to help the opposition, and that Syrians themselves would reconsider whether abandoning Assad was a wise decision, quote unquote, given the alternative. So it was kind of an attempt to posit himself as the lesser evil by creating another evil. So he did do many practical things to execute this decision. I can't go over them all now, but I'll give you a quick example. In late 2011, Assad released around 1,000 political prisoners in what was seen by many of us partisans of the Syrian cause as a concession or an attempt to, that we were winning, that we were weakening the regime. He was conceding to us. What we later found out was most of those around 1,000 political prisoners who were released were actually Salafist activists, many of whom were experienced commanders in Iraq. For example, one of those people who were released in mid-2011 was Zahran Alloush, who is now the leader of the newly formed Army of Islam. There's actually a photo of Zahran Alloush in Sednaya prison with Hassan Aboud, who is now the leader of Harar al-Sham, and Abu Isa, who is now the leader of Suqur al-Sham. Although I wouldn't call Suqur al-Sham jihadist necessarily, but just to give you an idea of how many of these people were in prison and now they aren't. But on the other hand, the regime has a policy of imprisoning civil society activists, seculars, leftists, young people, unarmed, nonviolent protesters, and letting them languish in prison indefinitely, while setting jihadis free and letting them run amok. So our brightest and most capable revolutionaries are stuck in prison, while these unarmed fundamentalists roam free. If that's not a calculated move, then I don't know what is. Furthermore, some of these brigades have control of Syria's oil fields and collaborate with the regime in keeping the oil flowing. Nusra, for example, don't even deny this. In an interview with a Nusra fighter, The Economist asked him, "Do you have contact with the Syrian regime?" He responded, "If it is in the interest of the Muslims, such as for gas or water, then we have no problem. These matters are in the hands of the Emir." So, given that, what I want to claim is that these are counter-revolutionaries in the literal sense of the term. They were set free to stifle the revolutionary ambitions of the Syrian people. Their interest is not self-determination of the Syrian masses, but to impose their narrow view of Islam on every Syrian citizen, willing or unwilling. The fact that many of them are foreigners is not the problem in and of itself, because we on the left have a proud tradition of accepting international volunteers to just causes. But these foreigners are coming in and seeking to impose their ideology and will on people already living in that area. I don't think that's international solidarity. That's occupation. The fact that they want an Islamic State is not a problem in and of itself either. The problem is that no small group, especially not any armed group, should be calling for any kind of state. The armed groups themselves are supposed to be the defenders of the Syrian people's path. But these armed groups are not. They are deciding and imposing their own path for the Syrian people, just like Bashar al-Assad has done and continues to do. Are there movements against them by the Syrian revolutionary masses? Yes, they exist, as the previous panelists showed, and they are widespread. The local coordination committees persist in doing their work. They have chapters in every Syrian city, yet they are ignored because they don't have beards nor guns. Many Syrian villages and towns have civil defense militias composed of locals from the neighborhood who fend off Assad forces. Yet we don't hear about them because they are not trans-regional. We hear about Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, because they have the resources to be trans-regional, to travel from place to place. Yet the lone militia, composed of 20 people from their neighborhood defending it, are never covered. We have activist networks all over Syria organizing aid smuggling projects, protests against the regime as well as ISIS, and collecting data on martyrs and prisoners. They do all this work in the midst of regime airstrikes and jihadi threats. This is the revolutionary process, in my opinion, against the regime and against the jihadists. In sum, are the jihadis the majority of the revolutionary movement? No, because if you look back to March 2011, you'll know that the popular masses who rose up against the regime in the first place outnumbered them by many times. And that popular movement today may not be as visible anymore, but it still exists. And it is a revolutionary movement. And perhaps in the short term, they will not win, as they get pushed to the sidelines. But simply the fact that they don't have the guns or resources does not make them non-existent. Because they are the true revolutionaries of Syria, and they are our only chance of attaining the Syria we all want to see, based on bread, freedom, and social justice. So what I would like to really drive home is, please do not write off these activist networks and these true revolutionaries, just like we don't write off activist networks here in the US and vote Democrat. Just like we don't write off the revolutionary socialists in Egypt and say you're either Ikhwan or Muslim Brotherhood or you're with Sisi. Our comrades and allies all over the Middle East have a long road ahead of them until victory. But if the revolution that started in 2011 did anything, they paved that road for us and showed us the way. So please, let's stop this hyper-obsession on short-term political outcomes and at least give the long-term revolutionary process the attention it deserves. Thank you. And